March 29, 1943. The skies above the Russell Islands shimmered in the midday heat, a cathedral of blue split by wisps of cloud that drifted like funeral veils. Lieutenant Masao Sato banked his Mitsubishi A6M Zero through the thermal currents, feeling the aircraft respond to his touch like a living thing. For 2 years, these skies had belonged to him and his brothers. 2 years since Pearl Harbor, since the world learned to fear the crimson sun painted on their wings. The Zero had been invincible, lighter, faster, more maneuverable than anything the Americans could field. Sato had painted 7 kill marks on his fuselage. He expected to add an 8th today. Then he saw it, a dark silhouette emerging from a cloud bank at 12 o'clock high, descending with the terrible patience of a raptor selecting its prey. The sound reached him first, not the high whine of Japanese engines he knew by heart, but something deeper, a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the cockpit frame itself. The aircraft that dove toward his formation was unlike anything in the intelligence briefings. Its nose stretched forward like the snout of some prehistoric beast, its wings bent in an unnatural gull configuration that defied the elegant simplicity of Japanese design. This was the Vought F4U Corsair, and in the seconds before Lieutenant Sato's Zero disintegrated under a withering stream of 50 caliber rounds, he understood that everything had changed. The Japanese Empire had built its aerial doctrine on a philosophy of spiritual superiority married to technological precision. The Zero embodied this perfectly, a fighter stripped of armor, of self-sealing fuel tanks, of anything that might add weight and reduce performance. It could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange any opponent. Japanese pilots trained for years in peacetime, honing skills that transformed aircraft into extensions of their will. By late 1942, they believed themselves untouchable, masters of an element that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. American pilots were viewed as soft, undisciplined, products of a decadent democracy that valued comfort over sacrifice. The official line from Tokyo spoke of American cowardice, of pilots who would break formation at the first sign of danger, who lacked the spiritual fortitude for true aerial combat. This wasn't propaganda alone. It was reinforced by early victories, by the smoking wreckage of American fighters that littered Pacific Islands from Wake to Java. Then the Corsair arrived, and with it came a reckoning that shattered 2 years of certainty. The F4U wasn't designed to be graceful. It was designed to be overwhelming. Its Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower, more than 50% greater than the Zero's power plant. This brute force translated into a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest fighters in the world. Where the Zero climbed through willowy elegance, the Corsair climbed through raw mechanical fury, its engine temperature running so hot that pilots joked about frying eggs on the cowling. The Americans had built a machine that embodied their industrial philosophy. More power, more ammunition, more armor, more of everything. 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, could saw a Zero in half in a 2-second burst. The weight penalty that Japanese engineers obsessively avoided became American doctrine, because they had the engines to carry it, the manufacturing capacity to build it, and the pilots to fly it. Japanese pilots encountered the Corsair first in February 1943 during strikes against Guadalcanal. The initial reports filtered back through command channels with a hesitancy that bordered on disbelief. American fighters were diving from altitude at speeds that made interception impossible, executing hit-and-run attacks that gave no opportunity for the turning dogfight, where Zero pilots held every advantage. When Japanese formations tried to climb to meet them, the Corsairs simply climbed faster, maintaining energy and altitude while the lighter Zeros struggled in the thinner air. The fundamental mathematics of aerial combat had shifted. Speed, firepower, and survivability now trumped maneuverability. It wasn't that Japanese pilots suddenly lost their skill or courage. It was that their skill no longer mattered in the way it once had. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces with over 60 confirmed kills, wrote in his combat diary about his first encounter with the Corsair near Rabaul. He described watching helplessly as his wingman Zero came apart under American fire, how the Corsair pilot never attempted a turning engagement but simply extended away, climbing back to altitude where pursuit was futile. Sakai noted the psychological impact with characteristic honesty. We had been told Americans would not press home attacks against determined resistance. This pilot showed no hesitation, no fear. He struck and vanished like a lightning bolt, and we could not catch lightning. The diary entry ended with a single sentence that captured the spiritual crisis spreading through Japanese fighter units. The sky no longer feels like ours. By mid-1943, Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible to Japanese commanders. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, flying from Guadalcanal, claimed 100 enemy aircraft destroyed against only 11 Corsairs lost, a ratio of better than 9-1. VMF 215 recorded a similarly devastating tally. These weren't flukes or exaggerations inflated for propaganda. Japanese records, meticulously maintained even as the war turned against them, confirmed catastrophic losses whenever Corsairs engaged in significant numbers. Experienced pilots who had terrorized the Pacific since 1941 found themselves hunted by younger American flyers with a fraction of their flight hours, but vastly superior machines. The calculus of survival inverted, where once Japanese pilots expected to return from missions with new victories. Now they calculated odds of simply making it back to base. The transformation manifested in ways beyond mere statistics. Japanese tactical doctrine, built over decades and validated by early war success, crumbled when confronted by American material superiority. Fighter sweeps that once dominated contested airspace now resulted in decimated formations. Escort missions became suicide details as Corsairs shredded protective fighter screens to reach vulnerable bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. The spiritual confidence that had sustained Japanese aviators through brutal training and suicidal orders began eroding mission by mission, encounter by encounter. Pilots who survived engagements with Corsair squadrons spoke in hushed tones about the futility of maneuvering against aircraft that simply refused to turn, that attacked from impossible angles at impossible speeds, that absorbed damage which would have destroyed any Japanese fighter while continuing to prosecute attacks with mechanical precision. There's a sound that became symbolic of this transformation. The deep, drumming roar of the Corsair's engine at full throttle, audible long before the aircraft came into visual range. Japanese ground crews on forward bases learned to recognize it, pausing their work to scan the skies with dread. Pilots waiting to scramble would hear that distinctive growl and feel their stomachs tighten, knowing that the careful timing of intercept courses and altitude advantages had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. The sound became a herald of American industrial might made manifest in aluminum and steel, a physical representation of the disparity between nations. Japan could produce skilled pilots through rigorous selection and training, but America could produce both pilots and overwhelming numbers of superior aircraft simultaneously. The Corsair's roar announced this truth to every listener: we are coming, and you cannot stop us. By 1944, the transformation was complete. Japanese fighter pilots operated under a blanket assumption that any encounter with Corsairs would result in casualties, likely fatal. Training commands began emphasizing defensive maneuvers and formation discipline designed merely to survive engagement long enough for bombers to reach their targets. The offensive spirit that had carried Japanese aviation across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 became memory, replaced by grim determination and fatalistic courage. Ace pilots, who had once spoken confidently about American inadequacy, now focused on techniques for escaping rather than engaging. Some sought transfer to kamikaze units, reasoning that a purposeful death carried more meaning than being hunted through empty skies by an enemy they could neither outrun nor outfight. The Americans, for their part, came to understand the Corsair as validation of their entire approach to war. This wasn't about individual heroism or warrior spirit, though Marine and Navy pilots displayed both in abundance. It was about system, about industrial capacity married to tactical innovation. The Corsair succeeded because America could afford to build a fighter that weighed twice as much as its opponent, could afford the aluminum and the engines, and the fuel to keep thousands of them flying simultaneously across the world's largest ocean. Japanese pilots weren't inferior. They were simply outnumbered and outgunned by a margin that training and courage couldn't overcome. The machine became metaphor, American pragmatism, and overwhelming resources against Japanese refinement and spiritual dedication. One philosophy built aircraft that kept pilots alive through armor and firepower. The other built aircraft that sacrificed pilot survival for performance metrics that no longer determined victory. There exists a photograph, taken sometime in early 1945 at a captured Japanese airfield on Okinawa. In the foreground sits a Corsair, its distinctive bent wings and long nose unmistakable. Behind it, arranged in a line like prisoners awaiting judgment, stand 3 captured Zeros. The size disparity is striking. The Corsair dwarfs its opponents, its bulk and power evident even in stillness. But more striking is the condition of the aircraft. The Corsair shows combat wear, paint chipped, fabric control surfaces patched, but fundamentally intact. The Zeros are immaculate, pulled from camouflaged revetments where they'd been hidden away, conserving fuel and pilots for a decisive battle that would never come. They remained beautiful, perfect expressions of aeronautical efficiency. They were also completely obsolete, relics of an aerial warfare philosophy that American industry had rendered extinct. The final tallies tell their own story. The Corsair achieved an overall kill ratio of 11-to-1 in combat against Japanese aircraft. Over 12,000 were built, serving with distinction not just in the Pacific, but in Korea and with foreign air forces into the 1960s. It remained in production until 1952, a frontline fighter for nearly a decade. The Zero, by contrast, became increasingly vulnerable as the war progressed, its fundamental design unable to evolve to meet changing tactical realities. By 1945, Zero pilots faced not just Corsairs, but Hellcats, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, an entire generation of American fighters that treated the once dominant Japanese aircraft as prey. The sky that Lieutenant Sato had considered his domain in 1943 had become an American hunting ground where survival itself represented victory. But there remained, even in defeat, a recognition of what the encounter between these two aircraft represented. The Corsair didn't just defeat the Zero. It invalidated the entire philosophy that created the Zero. Japanese military aviation was built on scarcity, on making every advantage count because resources were limited and replacements uncertain. American aviation was built on abundance, on the confident assumption that whatever was lost could be replaced, that overwhelming force was always available to bring to bear. When these philosophies collided at 300 miles per hour in the tropical skies of the Pacific, the outcome was never truly in doubt. The question was only how long Japanese pilots could endure against mathematics that worked inexorably against them. The war ended with Japanese aviation shattered, its best pilots dead, its aircraft obsolete or destroyed, its doctrine exposed as inadequate for modern industrial warfare. The Corsair flew on, transitioning seamlessly into peacetime service, into new conflicts, into aviation history, as one of the most successful fighters ever designed. That disparity in fates tells the deeper story, not of courage or skill, which both sides possessed in measure, but of systems and philosophies, of what nations could build and sustain, of how industrial capacity ultimately determined military outcomes, regardless of individual heroism. There are no recordings of what Lieutenant Masao Sato thought in those final seconds, as the Corsair's guns tore through his Zero's unarmored fuselage. Perhaps he recognized the sound that had haunted Japanese pilots for months, that deep, relentless engine roar that signified American presence and power. Perhaps he understood in that last moment that the sky had never truly belonged to him, that it had merely been loaned temporarily until America chose to reclaim it. The Corsair represented not just a superior machine, but a superior system, an economy of war that could absorb losses, iterate designs, and produce overwhelming force faster than any opponent could adapt. The Japanese pilot skill, honed through thousands of hours of peacetime training, meant nothing against an enemy that could replace both pilots and aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. The sky remembers. Above the Russell Islands, above Rabaul and Okinawa, and all the scattered atolls where young men fought and died, the air still carries the echo of that distinctive engine note, deeper than a whistle, more profound than thunder. It was the sound of dominance reclaimed, of industrial democracy asserting itself against martial aristocracy, of a philosophy of abundance overwhelming a philosophy of perfection. The Corsair dominated skies that Japanese pilots once called their own not through superior courage or skill, but through the simple, brutal calculus of overwhelming force applied with systematic precision. In the end, the sky belonged not to the most skilled or the most dedicated, but to those who could build the most and sustain the longest. That truth, written in contrails and gunsmoke and the wreckage of elegant fighters torn apart by American .50 caliber fire, endures as the Corsair's final legacy, a testament to how wars are won not in the air alone, but in the factories and foundries and forges that feed the machines of conflict. The roar of the engine fades, but its meaning remains. Victory belongs to those who can afford it.